Just put your thumbs up. Yeah, lovely. Good. Thank you, Amy. I saw you anyway. Lovely. Great stuff. Good. And thank you for that introduction, Adam. And first of all, as a little bit of a precursor, I am dosed up with cough mixture and strepsils and a glass of water, so I'm hoping I will get through this session without collapsing in a croaky heap. But I do apologise that I'm a little bit under the weather today, and not well. I'm hopefully firing on all cylinders, but I'm just alerting you that if I start to cough, I might just have to give myself a slug of cough mixture. So thanks for the introduction, Adam. And first of all, a little bit of a brief introduction for those who don't know me. I'm Jo Moffat, and I'm founder and managing director of specialist advertising agency Woodreed, and we're specialists in that we apply the techniques, the creativity and the insight-led approach of the advertising world to help businesses engage their people and create high-performing cultures inside their organizations. That's my day job, but I'm here under the auspices of Engage for Success, wearing my Engage for Success volunteer hat. I'm partnerships and strategy director for Engage for Success, and I also co-host the weekly radio show where we share stories of change and best practice on employee engagement. We're 8 years now into that radio show, and it's a very rich archive of content, which I would highly recommend. So Engage for Success, for those of you who are not familiar with the movement, we are a not-for-profit social movement, and we're the UK's leading authority on employee engagement. Engage for Success was established 10 years ago as a result of the government commissioned Engaging for Success, or McLeod report, which often people know it as. And the movement works entirely through volunteers like myself, but all around the country, to provide evidence, research and case studies to help UK PLC create a more engaged, productive and profitable workforce. And our purpose is inspiring people and workplaces to thrive, the title of the presentation. And you know, I think we can all agree that that's never been more important than it is now, wherever those workplaces may be and whatever format they may take. I'm going to be talking for about half an hour on this topic, and so we've built in time at the end for questions. By all means, chuck them in as we go along on the chat, using the chat box, or save them up to the end, and we can have a conversation. We're a relatively small enough group that actually I think we could even open things up to actual human speech rather than just relying on the chat functions. So so that's who we are. So let's get cracking. So first of all, what is employee engagement? Last time I looked at Google and actually typed in what is employee engagement, it brought up 652 million answers to that question. When I did that about a year ago, it was only just over 3 million. So these things are just, you know, ratcheting up exponentially. I think there are as many answers to the definition of what employee engagement is as there are Google search returns, but the one that I like, because it's simple and I think it says it all, and I like simplicity, is actually one that I stole from HSBC, and it is that, hang on a sec, why hasn't that done? Here we go. The skills to leave and the desire to stay. And an engaged employee has the skills to leave and the desire to stay. There's numerous definitions which are all, you know, terribly complex and quite sort of deep and profound. But to me, this says it all. And in the current world of the so-called Great Resignation, this is possibly even more apposite than ever. But I don't really care what we call it or how we define it. It seems to me what matters to commercial, organizational, and indeed, you know, individual success and well-being is not the label on the box. It's not how we define employee engagement, whether we argue about whether employee experience is more important or how those things are connected. To me, what matters is what we as individuals, as people managers and senior leaders actually do on a day-to-day basis in our workplaces, and our virtual and hybrid workplaces too, of course. What matters is how we act, act and how we interact with each other, and most importantly, how we do that in a sustained and consistent and increasingly important and in an intentional way across our organizations to build trust. It's about inspiring people and workplaces to thrive. And it doesn't really matter how you define it, what you call it, how you label employee engagement. This image is what it looks like in practice when we don't manage to achieve it. You know, you can see the white van driving along the road, painting the white lines. Oh dear, there's a log fallen across the road. Shall I bother getting out, moving the log, keep the nice straight line? No, I can't be bothered. I'll just drive around it. You know, that is a very simple way of defining what disengagement can actually look like. So I want to start with some scary numbers, and I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that you know you kind of actually answer this, but just in your mind, I wonder if you can think about what sort of figure you might put on the cost to this country's annual gross domestic product, thanks to the fact that we have relatively low levels of employee engagement in the UK. So what is it costing us in terms of GDP because our employee engagement levels in this country fall below those of other G7 economies? You might think, for example, that it is 260 million pounds a year it's costing us. That's a figure you might imagine it could be. You might be a little bit more negative about life and say it's costing us £4 billion a year, or is it £26 billion a year, or is it in fact the quite eye-watering and staggering figure of £340 billion a year? These are all numbers that we see bandied about to one extent or another. Well, the actual answer as far as Engage for Success is concerned is it's costing us in every year as a country, in terms of our GDP, £26 billion of lost contribution to our country's bottom line. Now, where does that come from? Well, evidence shows that there is an intrinsic link between employee engagement and productivity. Productivity in the UK is roughly 20% below the rest of the G7. So if we bring our productivity levels in the UK up to the level of, say, the Netherlands, then that would add £26 billion to our bottom line GDP every year. Now, that's an estimate that the Engage for Success movement took, and that is just based on productivity alone. Some of those other figures that I suggested might be the figure you're looking at, some of those higher figures that we often see badged about, particularly by people like Gallup and some of the major global consultancies, which are eye-watering in size, are because they often take into account other KPIs, which are also impacted by employee engagement, because it is not just productivity. There are plenty of other KPIs that are impacted by levels of engagement that we can add back into the mix to create the evidence for why these things matter. So, for example, this is an ad from First Direct. They have a very classic style of advertising, a very classic tone of voice to their advertising. And this is one that I saw on the side of a building. We came #1 for overall service and just happened to have this gigantic poster lying around. Pure coincidence. Well, yes, pure First Direct advertising tone of voice. But I wonder too, whether it is pure coincidence that they as an organisation take employee engagement incredibly seriously, have always done so, and have consistently delivered in terms not only of customer experience and customer satisfaction since their launch in 1995, but also in terms of their profitability. So that's another link that we see. Then if we take everyone's favourite sandwich bar, well, my favourite sandwich bar certainly, Pret a Manger, very, very focused on employees and organisational culture and employee engagement. And they have delivered, and this I have to caveat this with, this is pre-COVID, because, you know, obviously things went out the window for the hospitality industry very rapidly. But prior to that, Pret had been delivering like-for-like sales increases every quarter for 34 consecutive quarters, and they care about their culture, they care about their employee engagement. So customer satisfaction, customer loyalty, sales, profitability, and many other business critical KPIs are impacted by levels of engagement. It matters. And there's just a couple of, or a few others for you on the screen here. It helps with recruitment. It helps with engagement with learning and development. It impacts on levels of absenteeism. It even impacts on health and safety in the workplace. And if you add all of those factors, then you can easily see how that 26 billion is actually a very conservative estimate of the cost to our UK economy of not getting this stuff right. And it isn't just a private sector issue either. Within the public sector, we see improvements to citizen outcomes through employee engagement. Engage for Success ran a public sector day in conjunction with the Cabinet Office about 18 months, 2 years ago now. And that whole day shared case studies from across the public sector, the emergency services, NHS, education, local governments, and as well as central government, where they had been able to demonstrate improvements in citizen outcomes as a result of taking employee engagement very seriously and approaching it systematically and intentionally. And there's just a couple that struck me and that I think are interesting to share with you. One was from the Met Police, Metropolitan Police in London, and they were able to demonstrate in the borough of Kingston, so within the Met, different parts operate independently, but they're still under the auspices of the Met Police. In the borough of Kingston, over a 3-year period, they outperformed the whole of the Met Police in terms of their employee engagement scores. They doubled the percentage of crimes solved and reduced the number or the percentage of complaints from their community by 59%. And they did it by using the Engage for Success model that I'm going to be sharing with you in a few minutes' time. First group, we talked about health and safety. They have a thing, they're one of the major transport companies, as I'm sure you're aware, big operator of buses and trains. And on the train side of things, they have a measure called SPADS, which is signals passed at danger. And what they were able to show was that there were less SPADs or signals passed at danger from those depots within their rail network where engagement levels were higher than from those depots where engagement levels were lower. And in the healthcare system too, research has shown a clear link in the NHS between engagement and KPIs around mortality and patient outcomes. So it literally matters in terms of life and death almost. So in conclusion, coming back to what we call it, I don't think it matters. For me, employee engagement is simply a proxy for long-term organisational performance. It is as important to get that right as it is to get the other aspects of running an organisation and running a business right. So why does an engaged workforce matter in the 21st century? Why can't workplaces and working practices carry on as they have for decades with command and control management styles? Why has employee engagement become such an important thing? Well, there's a number of things that have come together, if you like, to create a bit of a perfect storm. The world of work has changed in recent decades as our society has changed. The world of work, despite COVID, despite hybrids, despite all of the challenges that have been flung at us in the last 20 months, the world of work is now operating in a completely different way from when many of us, certainly myself, joined the workforce. And so, as I say, there is this sort of perfect storm. And I love this quote, which is from Justin Trudeau in Canada. The pace of change that we're currently experiencing has never been this fast, yet it will never be this slow again. So, you know, none of this stuff is going away anytime soon. So one of the biggest changes in the workplace has been around demographics. We now have anything up to 5 generations in the workplace. And what we mean by a generation are people who were born within a particular time frame, whose responses and ways of working are shaped by the different experience they've been exposed to at that time. That isn't to say that people are clones of each other. That isn't to say that boomers are all the same as each other, that Gen X are all the same as each other, that Gen Y and millennials are all the same as each other. But it does mean that the way they respond to things and the way they act in the workplace and in their workplaces is nonetheless shaped by experiences that are unique to that particular generation. And it can be useful for us. And then in addition to that, what else has changed? Well, we as consumers have changed out of all recognition in the last few decades. The biggest change is that our voice is sought, whether it be, I mean, Adam's going to do it after this presentation. He's asking for feedback. But when we go on eBay, we go on Amazon, we go on TripAdvisor, Trustpilot, everyone wants to know how our experience was, what we thought. And we don't turn that off when we put on our work clothes, when we arrive at work or leave ourselves at the workplace threshold or shuffle down to the kitchen table in our PJs. You know, we expect our voices to be heard in the workplace just as much as we do. We're much more demanding as consumers, and we bring that with us to work. The other thing that's happened to contribute to this perfect storm has been a loss of trust and deference throughout society. You know, once upon a time, we would defer to people because they were in a position of authority, simply because of their role, their title. But that's changed, not least because of huge corporate scandals, but more generally because we work in a world where leaders have to earn trust and respect, and rightly so in my book. You know, they don't just get it by dint of their role that they perform. And then, of course, technology. I mean, you know, that has been a massive force for change in the way work works and the power dynamic inside organizations. And from an employee engagement and OD and HR perspective, tech also means that what goes on tour no longer stays on tour. Sites like Glassdoor, I had a quick look, 55 million unique visitors every month. Potential recruits to your business are finding out what it's like to work with you. And that employee advocacy can be a very powerful force for good for employers, but equally get that wrong and it can be extremely damaging. So all of those things have profound implications for us and our workplaces and our health and well-being in that workplace and in our communities. And as a nation, sadly, we really aren't getting it right when it comes to engaging our workforce and unleashing their talent and innovation. As I say, lagging behind other members of the G7 when it comes to employee engagement. So what is the answer? Well, luckily, there is a simple framework that you can use and that I'm going to spend the rest of this session running through with you. And it works wherever and however and whatever structure of organisation you are operating or involved with. So in the original Engage for Success report, co-authors David McLeod and Nita Clark identified what they call the 4 enablers, and those are summarised here on the screen for you, the 4 enablers of engagement. Now, they're very much not a one-size-fits-all, but they are very much a useful lens to use to consider and improve engagement. We use them at Woodreed whenever we're working with clients to help them with values and culture programs. And we fuse with them the thinking of brand and the marketing-led approach and the insight-led approach of the advertising world. But the enablers are a very, very useful lens. And I'm going to take each of them, look at each of them in turn in a little bit more detail in a moment. But it's certainly the case, I think, I'm sure none of you would disagree that the last sort of 20 months have absolutely pushed the people agenda to the fore. You know, the theme of the Lincolnshire CIPD's trilogy is very much, you know, this changing world, this complex world, this world of uncertainty. And only in the last month or so, you know, recent job vacancy figures in September hit a record 1 million. Research is suggesting that upwards of 40% of people, some are even saying you know, are planning to leave their employer in the next 12 months. It's been called the Great Resignation. All of these things mean that organisations ignore employee engagement and the employee experience at their peril. You know, talent attraction and retention are key. The hospitality industry is working at what, 10% below capacity at the moment and struggling to find ready employees to fill those roles. So, you know, this has become something that is critically important for businesses' sustainability. There's no shortage of noise and talk about engagement. There's no shortage of noise and talk about well-being, about productivity, about diversity and inclusion. This is all to the good, and this is all, you know, important for people who are interested in this topic. But, you know, there's a bit of a gap going on out there. I came across some research from IBM last year, which says there's an awful lot of talk, but actually there's a bit of a say-do gap between what employers think they are delivering and what employees are feeling is their reality. And that's something that I think we need to be aware of and worry about. So this is just a snapshot of it here for you. So executives claiming that employee well-being is a top priority, the employer's perspective on the left of each of these two scores, but what the employees are saying is falling radically short of what their employers are saying. So, for example, only about half of employees say they believe that their employer is genuinely concerned about their welfare. Now, that suggests an issue of trust, and building trust and confidence among employees is going to be critical for the quality of our world and workplaces post-pandemic. How we treat employees now is going to have a massive impact on their perceptions about us as employers and the perceptions of how they are valued in the future about retention and development. So the four enablers really can be a very useful guide and framework to use to help us to address this. So I'd like to just now look at them in a little bit more detail. So enabler one, it's about having visible, empowering leaders who can tell the story of your organization, where it's come from and where it's going. So if we unpick this a little bit, really it's all about purpose. It's about having a strong organizational purpose, and it's about the quality of your leadership in that organization. And goodness, purpose has absolutely blasted to the front of the agenda in the last 20 months, not just the obvious in terms of key workers like NHS and care workers and utilities, or grocery chains feeding the nation, or Scania trucks keeping delivery vehicles on the road with their everyday transport heroes, but other manufacturing organisations, people like Brewdog turning over their gin lines to brewing hand sanitizer, Unilever doing the same. That gave us, we had a very obvious purpose in the last 20 months. But now, and I know we're not past it yet, but we do, you know, we are looking ahead, we are looking to the future, but we're looking, as the theme of these sessions is about, an uncertain future. So now is the time for leadership to really reflect on their organization's purpose for the future and articulate it. Is it compelling? Is it authentic? And how are they motivating their people to share in that and play their part in delivering that purpose? So I certainly need to do that. And in terms of having visible, empowering leaders, it is absolutely about leaders coming out from behind their scripted town halls. Many of them have done that during the pandemic. You know, they've been invited into their people's homes. They've invited their people into their homes and sat down with them at their kitchen tables. But that we must not let leadership hide, you know, run back behind the security of the unauthentic and scripted town hall presentations. We need our leaders to build on and maintain that visibility, that humanity, and most importantly, that authenticity, which has done so much to engage their people during the pandemic. There was some really good stuff that came out, you know, some silver linings to what was otherwise a pretty hideous experience for an awful lot of people. And one of the silver linings of the pandemic has been leadership's newfound authenticity and willingness to expose themselves to their people. And we must not let them hide, and we must not let that get lost in the future. So that is really enabler 1. Enabler 2 has always been important. It's around the role of line managers, people leaders, team leaders. And I'm sure we can all take a few minutes to think about the best and the worst managers that we have had in our careers and how they made us feel. I know I certainly can. Sometimes thinking about the worst ones I've had bring a chill down my spine, but I'm sure we've all had those hideous examples. How the very best actively promote and encourage our careers and give us space to grow, rather than micromanaging us, who don't take credit for our achievements, but who share that credit with their teams, who don't seek to apportion blame, but who see problems and mistakes as an opportunity to grow and learn. Because there is a cliche, but it's nonetheless a true, because it is a cliche, that people don't quit their companies, they quit their bosses. There was a lovely piece of research that Forbes uncovered in the US, which said that 62% of US workers would rather have a new boss than a pay rise. And Enabler 2 is about team leaders. It's about making sure that you recruit, train, and support line managers and team leaders to lead their people well, to treat them as individuals, to coach them and stretch them, and not suffocate them with micromanaging. So that, you know, the role of the line manager has always been pivotal, but it is now more important than ever. Line managers who can mentor and inspire, who really can treat their people as individuals. Now, imagining in a hybrid workplace, that role of that line manager, the team leader, to know that actually Amy prefers to have a check-in every day over the phone, and actually Terry is much happier and more comfortable with a Zoom catch-up, and actually would really only like that every other day, then that is, you know, that is really, really important stuff to know. It's about knowing the individual preferences and dealings and wishes of your people, that they might prefer to have a conversation while they're out walking the dog, or that they're never going to be able to talk to you at 4 o'clock because that's when the kids come home from school. Whatever it might be, it's treating them in a nuanced way as individuals rather than a one-size-fits-all. And remember as well that most line managers, people leaders, team leaders are actually very much that hard-pressed middle, because they're not only trying to learn the skills to deal with their team's needs in this complex and ever-changing world, but they are on the receiving end of their own managers and bosses applying that to them with the varying degrees of capability and success. So we need to make sure that we support our people with management skills to learn those hard to learn, softer people skills. It is all the more important that those are applied intentionally, particularly in a hybrid workplace. We need to make sure that managers are given the tools to handle difficult situations with sensitivity. We need to think about how we support our line managers who've maybe got new starters in their teams, people they perhaps have never met, and what slightly different skills do they need to do that effectively and well. Take that to an even greater extreme. Think about line managers who maybe have first jobbers in their teams, who've not even not just new to your business, but they're new to the world of work entirely, who've never had the benefit of learning by osmosis or sitting next to Nellie about just what it's like to work, what it's like to be at work. And one of the things I talked about, the varying generations in the workplace, touched on it earlier. One of the things that is true about Generation Z, the youngest generation that are now in our workplace, is that they as a generation have had far less formal opportunity to work before they joined the proper workplace or the proper workforce than generations before them. The opportunities to do paper rounds, Saturday jobs, lots of those things just aren't there for that younger generation. And so they've got to learn a whole new range of skills that perhaps previous generations had gradually got the hang of before they really got into the more formal workplace. So also line managers need help to think about the learning and development of their people. How can they be proactive about that in a world where they're not necessarily seeing their teams on a day-to-day basis? If they are only in a hybrid workplace, they need to be much more intentional and much more specific about having an eye on the learning and development opportunities that their people might be hungry for, but are finding it easy to be overlooked to engage with. So again, there's an awful lot of weight on the shoulders of these poor line managers and team leaders. They really are the hard-pressed middle. And if none of this chimes, I think there's one other thing that is worth pondering. If you are a line manager or a people leader, then studies that Engage for Success has done, both in the private and the public sector, have found that the better line managers engage their teams, the higher their own performance ratings in their own performance assessments and reviews are. So it's actually a win-win for everybody. And we've particularly, the link on the slide that you're seeing there is a new zone that we've created on the Engage for Success website, purely for engaging managers. And there's a wealth of free resources there. As with everything on the Engage for Success website, all the resources are free to access, free to use, free to make the most of. So I would point you towards that. Okay, third enabler is around employee voice. As I've already said, as consumers, we expect to have our voice heard, and it's the same in the workplace. And one of the biggest risks to businesses is reputational risk. And yet employee voice listened to could have prevented many of the things that cause corporate or business scandals from becoming so. Nita Clark, one of the founders and co-author of the original report, she calls employee voice the best smoke alarm an organization can have. And I love that. But we need to find ways to listen to it, and we need to find ways to tap into it. Employee voice as well is really, really important around innovation and creativity. Very often, those people who are doing the job, working on the front line, are the ones that can tell you how to improve that process, how to do it better, how to enhance that customer experience, if we would only ask them. And it's a quite frightening statistic that if you ask engaged employees, 59% of them say that work brings out their most creative ideas. And that surely is what an employer wants of their people. You ask that same question of disengaged employees and only 3% say that work brings out their most creative ideas. So tapping into employee voice is really, really important. And when we talk about employee voice, we're not just talking about a survey. In fact, we're really not talking about a survey at all. We're talking about listening to your people on an ongoing basis. It clearly was front and center through the peak of the pandemic, organizations checking in, asking people what they need, listening and acting on feedback, asking people how they are, but actually bothering to listen to the answer, how are you really? Involving employees in scoping out and planning a safe return to the workplace, what that shape of that new workplace should look like, how hybrid can work, how hybrid should work, involving people in that. Employee voice is about listening to that voice in real time, doing it in a way that's transparent, and sharing feedback in an open and honest way to build trust. So whatever stage your organization is at, what are people doing on a local level to listen to and act on employee voice to really improve process and experience for your people, but ultimately as well, customers, clients, communities with whom your businesses interact? It is really crucial. And then finally, the fourth enabler is around what we call organizational integrity. And if we get this right, we will build trust. And trust surely is one of the most defining issues of our times, whether that's leaders trusting their people, managers trusting their people when they no longer see them every day, employees trusting their colleagues, employees trusting their managers and their leaders to keep them safe. In all of this, we are judged by our actions and not our words. So going back to that IBM slide I shared at the beginning, claiming to put your people's well-being as a priority, but actually failing to support them in practical terms with kit that works, with tech that creates multiple micro stressors because of the fact none of it's joined up properly. That creates mental health issues, creates stress, compounds stress, and that is a clear failing. Failing to address the processes and practices which can impact, especially on mental health, is a clear failing. So we have to work hard to maintain organizational integrity. It's about making sure that the values on the wall, or the values on the intranet, or the values on the home screen are reflected in the day-to-day behaviors of everyone in the organization at all levels, that there is no say one thing, do another gap anywhere. And that's everyone from the newest recruit to the newest recruit who's not yet set foot in the head office or corporate workplace, to the most senior leader and board member. It applies across the board. And successful organizations like the Pret and First Direct that I mentioned before know that this isn't about having rigid codes of conduct and beating people for failure to conform. It's about giving people freedom and autonomy within a framework to translate those behaviors to make them relevant and authentic for the role and the function that they're delivering, to make sure that those values are credible. But if we don't have behaviors supporting them, they're meaningless. Behaviors which are ignored when it's inconvenient to enact them, behaviors which are ignored when the going gets tough, or don't apply to the toxic leader or manager because actually they're really good at selling and we can't afford to call them out over it, will simply become something that ends up in a drawer and disregarded by everybody else. But when we get values and behaviors overlapping, we create trust, and trust is crucial to engagement. So make it your business to know and understand your values, role model them, and actively acknowledge and recognize when you see your people demonstrating them. Celebrate successes and share examples to encourage your wider team. And importantly, don't be afraid to call out toxic behaviors. Don't allow toxic behaviors to go unchallenged, because that will just bring the whole house of cards crashing down around you and destroy that trust. Trust takes years to build, and it can be lost in the, in the blink of an eye. So there we are, that summarizes them. And I think I spend a lot of time hanging around on LinkedIn. I speak at quite a lot of conferences and do a lot of work, as I've said, with Engage for Success, and chair conferences and so on. And there is no shortage of inspiring stories of organizations and businesses who get this right and who are working really, really hard to do this stuff, and to do this stuff intentionally, keep their people front and center, support their line managers, equip their leaders to lead with humanity and clear purpose. But it takes consistency and intentionality to make it something that becomes part of what you do on a daily basis. Otherwise, it's very, very easy to make the great stories that we all hear at events and conferences, the tip of an iceberg with everything going on below the surface being disengagement. And that would be, that is tragic, and it's tragic for most of the workforce in this country. So the 4 enablers are a simple framework for how we operate, how we can act more intentionally to be true to them. And if we do that, we can really transform employee engagement. The 4 enablers can help you drive trust, attract and bind the right talent to your organization for the long term, putting people at the heart of our organizations and keeping that message top of every agenda, because it really is the only course for a sustainable future for our organizations. Think back to those terrifying figures, 1 million vacancy, 1 in 4 thinking of resigning. Other reports, 40%. We have to take these things seriously, and this is a very simple way to do that. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you for your time. We have now time for some questions, and some contact details there on the slide if you want to get involved, want to find out more about Engage for Success, find out more about the radio show, whatever it might be. So thank you, and I'll now open things up to questions. So would it be a good idea if I stopped sharing, Adam? Probably would, wouldn't it?
Yes, please, Jo. That would be great. Thank you so much. Okay. That was incredibly interesting and fascinating, Jo. And I think in the framework that you've shared, I'm sure you've given us all some real good food for thought about how we might take that forward into our own organisations.
Thank you. Pleasure. I'm glad my voice held out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well done. If anybody would like to ask a question, perhaps just use the raise hand function in the reactions on your control panel. But just whilst everyone's thinking about that and getting to grips with the technology, Jo, may I kind of just kick off with a question, which is, in terms of the framework, is the order in which you presented them sequential, and is that the order in which we should think about and tackle those issues within our organisations, or does it not matter?
Right, they are not sequential. They are not. One is more, the first one is more important than the other. I actually often find that they become meshed and blended, and they kind of integrate with each other, because if you think about it, an effective line manager or people leader who is treating their people as individuals and consciously working to stretch and coach them is by definition doing that from insight gained by listening to their people and listening to their teams. So no, I think they are all equally important, and they all have their place. Doesn't mean to say that you have to start them all at once. I don't think either you need to sort of see them as something rigid to sort of force yourself into, because they're not actually, they're not overly complicated to get your head around. They're not rocket science, are they? But they are nonetheless what McLeod and David McLeod and Nita Clark identified as common to organizations with high levels of employee engagement. These were the sort of shared traits. And I think that they are a very, very useful guide. And I am so familiar with them now that and have been for quite a few years. They're always in my mind. I always have them they're always there in my consciousness whenever I'm thinking about these things or doing anything. And I think that's what you want to aim to get to, is to just always think, well, okay, so where does our purpose play out in that? And what's the role of the leadership, and how are we going to make sure that if we take our line managers, they need to be able to articulate the purpose too. So are they in enabler 2, or are they in enabler 1 about articulating the story of where the organisation has come from, where it's going? They do tend to blend and merge, but they're all important and they should all be there. But don't beat yourself up if you're thinking, well, actually, we're pretty good at listening to employee voice. Maybe we're not doing some of these other things yet. So long as you can start thinking intentionally about trying to do them, then you'll get to where you need to be. It's quite interesting when we revamped the Engage for Success website some few years ago. And one of the things that people wanted to think about trying to do was to tag all the content according to which enabler it played to. And it became virtually impossible to do that, because you just end up saying, well, it's actually 1, but it's 2 as well. And oh, there's a bit of 3 in there and a bit of 4. So they are very much a meshing, matrixy, frameworky, lensy thing, just to kind of think about.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you, Jack. I can see Terry has got her hand up. So Terry, I don't know if you can take yourself off mute. Thank you.
Hopefully I can. Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Joe. Really thought-provoking, and my mind is whirring in terms of how I can take this forward. A question for you, though. I'm sure that you've often seen, as I have, that when it comes to employee engagement, the focus can often be around chasing one engagement rating or one engagement score. And I'm just thinking back to the slide that you shared with the KPIs on it. What advice would you give to people trying to move the employee engagement forward so that it drives some of the metrics on your earlier slide, but that are challenged with only having or only being tasked with improving that one employee engagement score?
Yeah. Oh, I feel your pain, Terry. I mean, you know, this is
sorry,
one of the.
Sorry, that's probably an unfair one, given the time that we have.
No. I think it's very difficult to. It's a challenge, isn't it? And I think it's a challenge that everyone gets, and it's a challenge that falls, I believe, stems from the fact that people think about, they get so hung up on what they mean by employee engagement, and how, and that they have to define it, and they have to give it to somebody as a job, and then that's given to someone whose responsibility is employee engagement manager, or you know, and what do you do? Oh, well, I do the survey. Well, no, you know, employee engagement is everyone's responsibility in an organization. It's absolutely leadership's responsibility, but it's equally everyone with people responsibility. And actually, I believe we all have a responsibility as employees for our own engagement too, and engaging that of our colleagues as well. So I kind of go back to root cause, really, Terry, which is that the problem stems from the fact that people think about employee engagement in one-dimensional terms as something that has to be measured through a survey. And unfortunately, the root cause of that is this ridiculous idea that we have in business that, you know, we only, if we can't measure it, it doesn't matter, and that everything has to be measured and everything has to have numbers by it. And actually, there's a different way of approaching the work, and that is thinking about engaging your people to, poor old you've got a cough as well, haven't you? Engaging your people to deliver on all of those things. So I would argue that we need to open our eyes to the fact that employee engagement impacts a whole raft of KPIs, and that we should therefore be looking to measure all of them. I'm trying to do some work for a little while with one of the big research companies, where we had a client who'd got employee engagement data. That particular client also had got customer satisfaction and loyalty data from a different source. And they had also got a huge amount of organizational data in terms of profitability, productivity, a whole load of stuff. And what we're trying to do is put all of that data into a bucket and start to prove some links, and actually be able to demonstrate that these things are totally connected. You know, that proof does exist. It's there with things like Heskett and James Heskett and the service profit chain, which goes back years, but it's still true to this day. But actually, it was trying to find some data, trying to find a way to actually simply take a load of organizational data and put it in a bucket and churn it out and be able to show that. Because once we can do that, we can actually, take the scales will fall from people's eyes. But it's a bit of a challenge to do. But my advice is really stop trying to think about engagement in one-dimensional terms. Let's not even think about trying to define it. Let's just think about what it means. As I said, I think somewhere back in the beginning, employee engagement is a proxy for organizational performance and success. And what are the things that matter in our organization? Well, sales, customer loyalty, customer satisfaction, the health and well-being of our people, absenteeism, our ability to attract talent, our ability to keep people. And if you do those 4 things around the 4 enablers, then you will impact all of those things. And you just need to believe it. And we kind of know it in our hearts, actually. Most of us who work in this field know that in our hearts. But if you need the data, go back to the Nailing the Evidence report on the Engage for Success website, where there's a lot of numbers, because I know execs like numbers.
Yep, thank you.
Really I think we have time for just one final question, if that's okay. So, Amy, if I could ask you to come in.
Thank you. Yes, I'll try and keep it brief in the interest of the time. So, Joe, I work in the logistics industry at the moment. What a challenging year it's been, hey, for everybody.
Me. Yes.
I suppose commercially, the business is throwing a lot of money at our drivers in particular to retain that resource. Because we've experienced a lot of turnover, which to some extent those measures have stemmed the bleed. But what we're now seeing is the repercussions on our management teams, where I suppose what's really resonating here with me is that say-do gap. So I suppose I'd welcome any advice or guidance you have, because I know your 4 enablers, the first 2 particularly, really are aimed at management being that enabler. How do we engage with them? How do we bring them on that journey through these really difficult times where we're almost sending out a bit of a contradictory message?
Do you mean senior leaders, or do you mean the sort of,
I'd say mid-level
shift supervisors, team leaders, depot managers, those sorts, Yeah. I mean, you are in a very difficult sector, aren't you? I know that. And I do also know from experiences that I have had and other people I've spoken to within your sector, there is quite a lot of, it's a bit how to say this politely. I don't think I can actually. Some fairly toxic management practices in the logistics sector. Let's get it out there. In certain in certain organisations, and I've no idea where you're from, and that's good. So I don't want to know. But they're not. There's some quite poor practices going on. I think you always have to persuade people. You always have to think about the what's in it for me, and you've got to get across to your leadership teams, your middle managers, that actually it will be better for them and easier for them and improve their satisfaction with their role and actually their own performance if they work harder at engaging their people. But that involves giving them support around softer skills. It involves running workshops with them around what actually we mean by employee engagement and what listening to your employee voice means, and responding to that in a way that is not command and control. And so often that's the model that we see in large workplaces and workplaces with not transient workforces, but workforces which are perhaps less skilled. It's much easier to just shout and yell and demand than to realize that something could be done in a different way. There is some data. There's some interesting stuff on the Engage for Success website. There's a team diagnostic tool, which I would happily, is free to use, which line managers can get their own teams to do, to find out what the dynamic is that's going on in their particular team. I'm going to just quickly put that in the chat for you.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, I definitely think.
And you can do that on a small scale. You know, if you've got a team of 6 or a team of a dozen, whatever, have a go at it, see where it takes you. It'll open their eyes to a few things, and they'll actually find out what's really going on. This isn't part of a big, broad survey. But then there's also some stuff around that point that I made, that actually this is good for their career. So that plays to the what's in it for me. I haven't got the link to that available at my fingertips, but you know, there is some case study on the site which I can try and find for you if you want to connect with me afterwards, say, which basically talks about how it is good for managers to engage their people, and it does the manager's career good as well.
That would be also very useful. Thanks, Joe. Appreciate that.
All right.
Amy, thank you for that question, and Joe, thank you very, very much indeed for your time and insights today.
It's a pleasure.
I think we could keep going on this topic.
Oh yes, I could talk all day, as you probably gathered.
Yeah. Well, we would love to listen to you, Joe, but in the interest of timing, I think it's my job just to pull today to a close. So to everybody who has joined us, thank you so much. It's really so great to see you. Thank you for engaging with the branch. Really hope to see you at our next event on the 24th. If you haven't already registered, please do that. And finally, Joe, on behalf of everyone here today, a huge thank you to you. Thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, all of you, and I wish you all well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks both. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.